Back in Chapter 1, where we discussed key Illustrator concepts, we covered something called selections. Now, let's focus on exactly how selections work when you're using Illustrator. For this chapter, I'm actually going to use this file called Making Selections. So if you have access to the exercise files, go ahead and open that file. Selecting things inside of Illustrator is probably more important than even using any of the drawing tools. Without knowing how to select things, it's very difficult for you to edit just about any piece of artwork inside of Illustrator. Day in and day out inside of Illustrator, you'll be using the two main selection tools, the regular selection tool, or the black arrow, and the direct selection tool, or the white arrow. In reality, there's a third selection tool here. If I press and hold down the mouse button on the direct selection tool, I'll see this something here called the group selection tool. We'll talk about that in a moment, and we'll see that really it's not necessary to actually physically choose that tool. So first, let's do a quick review of exactly the differences between the selection tool and the direct selection tool. The selection tool allows me to select entire objects and move them around as a whole. As you can see over here, this is actually a group of several different shapes. If I use the direct selection tool, I can click on parts of an object. Notice here that the line is staying behind. That allows me to dive into parts of an object. Or I can click on individual anchor points with the direct selection tool and move around the anchor point itself or the control handle for that anchor point. Additionally, if I do have the bounding box turned on, and I'll go to the View menu here, and I'll choose Show Bounding Box, then when you're using the regular selection tool, you will always see the bounding box when you select objects. However, when using the direct selection tool, you will not see the bounding box. And when you're using Illustrator, the Command key on your keyboard, or if you're on a PC, the Control key, basically allows you to toggle between these two selection tools. So for example, right now I have the direct selection tool active. Simply by holding down the Command key, it switches to the selection tool. Notice now the bounding box appears. As soon as I release the Command key or the Control key, then the bounding box disappears. As you're working in Illustrator, you're constantly moving back and forth between these selection tools. So it's important to know the keyboard shortcuts. As I said, if you're using either the selection tools, simply hold down the Command key to toggle between the two. However, if you're in another tool, for example, maybe you're drawing a rectangle, and you realize you want to select something, again, the Command key brings you back to the last selection tool that you've used. In this case here, the last one was the direct selection tool. As soon as you release the Command key or the Control key on Windows, you're back to drawing a rectangle. Alternatively, you can jump directly to these tools by pressing the V or the A keys on your keyboard. A cute way to remember that those are the keyboard shortcuts is that the V is like an inverted arrow, and the A is also like an arrow pointing upwards. In fact, the A is a shortcut for the white arrow or the direct selection tool. Why? Because the A has a little hollow center inside of it, which, again, some people refer to the white arrow as the hollow arrow. Again, it's a way to remember that the A key is the keyboard shortcut for the direct selection tool, and the V key is the keyboard shortcut for the selection tool. So now let's take a look at this other tool here called the group selection tool. And if I go ahead now, and I switch to the group selection tool, and I now click on, let's say, this surfboard here. We identified before that each of these surfboards are a group. It's actually the shape, and then the line that goes down the middle. If I click on it, notice that the shape itself has been selected. If I click a second time now, then the other objects inside of that group are selected, and now I can move the entire object around. So what the group selection tool allows me to do is basically target either a part of a group, but then without having to switch to anything else, click once again, and then simply select more objects or items in that particular group. In fact, it basically works according to the hierarchy of that group. Let me explain. Let's go back to the regular selection tool here for a moment, and we're going to change this file somewhat. I'm going to basically go ahead and click and drag to marquee select all these surfboards. I'm not going to go to the object menu. I'm going to choose group. We'll discuss more about groups later in Chapter 9, but for now, let's just go ahead and make a group out of this. I'll also go ahead here and select all these bodysuits and group them as well. I'll use the keyboard shortcut here, Command G or Control G. I'll do the same thing for all the flip-flops down here on the bottom. Group those as well. And now what I'll do is I'll select all of these objects, and I will group them, again, pressing the keyboard shortcut, Command G or Control G. So now if I use my regular selection tool and I click on even this one surfboard, this surfboard is not only within a group on its own, but it also is part of an overall group here, and additionally it belongs inside of a group with all these objects together. Remember that the selection tool itself does not really have the ability to go into a group, so it automatically selects the topmost group, which is all these objects. So if I wanted to just adjust something within this surfboard alone, using the selection tool, that would not be possible. I'm going to go ahead and deselect by clicking elsewhere. I'm not going to use the regular direct selection tool. I can click and I can go ahead and I can move just this part of the group itself of that particular surfboard. but I can't really move the entire surfboard on its own. So here's where the group selection tool comes into play. When I use the group selection tool, and I'll deselect over here, I can click once to select that piece of surfboard inside of that group, click again, and it now selects the group that belongs into. If I look over here, I see that I've now selected or targeted that group. Click now another time, and now all the surfboards in that first level of that group become selected. Click now again, and now all the other objects become selected. So each successive click with the group selection tool selects one group higher in my hierarchy in my particular file. In reality, there's no need to actually use the group selection tool because there's a keyboard shortcut that allows us to access that. I'll switch back to the regular direct selection tool. I'll deselect everything. If I decide that I want to click the surfboard here, and I want to adjust the surfboard, but I really now need to select the group because I need to have the line move with it as well, I'll hold down the Option key on my keyboard. I'm on a Mac, but if you're on the PC, hold down the Alt key, and then click again. It's the same thing right now. You can see that when I hold down the Option key or the Alt key, then a plus sign appears, which means that now Illustrator is toggling to the group selection tool. So it has the behavior of the group selection tool, basically that's now built into this direct selection tool itself. If I Option click again, now this entire group becomes selected. I can move these around individually. I'll press undo. Again, Option click one more time, and now all of them become selected. So now basically when I'm working inside of Illustrator, I will be using a combination of the regular selection tool to select entire groups, or if I want to select parts of the group, I will use the direct selection tool. I use the keyboard shortcut here. Simply go ahead and click on this object. If I wanted to select the entire group, I would Option click with that particular tool to make that particular thing happen. One great thing also about isolation mode is that there are certain things you might be able to do directly with the regular selection tool at all times. For example, in this case, if I did want to edit just the surfboard itself, I can kind of go the exact reverse. If I basically click right now, I'm selecting everything. I want to work with just the surfboards. I double click on the surfboards, and now notice over here I'm able to isolate just this group. Click again, now this group becomes isolated. Click again, this group becomes isolated. Click again, now I've gotten directly into this group itself, and I can move this shape around without moving this particular line around as well. I'm now inside of that group. I haven't left that particular selection tool, but I basically have done the reverse. If I were to use the direct selection tool, I can just click once and grab that surfboard and move it. With the selection tool, I can use isolation mode to start off with selecting everything and then drill down directly into that particular group. So I'm just going to go ahead and press undo. I'm going to double click here outside of the group. Now I've exited isolation mode, and that's a basic understanding of the selection tools inside of Illustrator. Now let's focus on using some of the other ways that you can select objects besides these particular selection tools.